The Fall, The Night. Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. This is an abridged version by James K. Patterson of the University of Cincinnati. The Fall, The Night of a Day's Tramp. An hour before sunset, on the evening of a day in the beginning of October, 1815, a man traveling afoot entered the town of D. The few persons who at this time were at their windows or their doors regarded this traveler with a sort of distrust. It would have been hard to find a passer-by more wretched in appearance. He was a man of middle height, stout and hearty in the strength of maturity. He might have been 46 or 7. A slouched leather cap half hid his face, bronzed by the sun and wind and dripping with sweat. His shaggy breast was seen through the coarse yellow shirt, which at the neck was fastened by a small silver anchor. He wore a cravat twisted like a rope, coarse blue trousers, worn and shabby, white on one knee, with holes in the other, an old ragged gray blouse, patched on one side, with a piece of green cloth sewed with twine. Upon his back was a well-filled knapsack, strongly buckled and quite new. In his hand he carried an enormous knotted stick. His stockingless feet were in hobnail shoes. His hair was cropped and his beard long. The sweat, the heat, his long walk, and the dust added an indescribable meanness to his tattered appearance. His hair was shorn, but bristly, for it had begun to grow a little, and seemingly had not been cut for some time. Nobody knew him. He was evidently a traveler. Whence had he come? From the south, perhaps from the sea, for he was making his entrance into D by the same road by which, 7 months before, the Emperor Napoleon went from Cannes to Paris. This man must have walked all day long, for he appeared very weary. Some women of the old town, which is at the lower part of the town, had seen him stop under the trees of a boulevard Crescendi and drink at the fountain, which is at the end of the promenade. He must have been very thirsty, for some children who followed him saw him stop not 200 steps further on and drink again at the fountain in the marketplace. When he reached the corner of Rue Poichevert, he turned to the left and went towards the mayor's office. He went in, and a quarter of an hour afterwards he came out. The man raised his cap humbly and saluted a gendarme who was seated near the door upon the stone bench, which General Drouot mounted on the 4th of March, to read to the terrified inhabitants of D the proclamation of Golfe-Juan. Without returning his salutation, the gendarme looked at him attentively, watched him from some distance, and then went into the city hall. There was then in D a good inn called Le Croix de Colbas. It hosted a man named Joachim Labert, a man held in some consideration in the town on account of his relationship with another Labert, who kept an inn at Grenoble called Trois Dauphins, and who served in the guides. The traveler turned his steps towards this inn, which was the best in the place, and went at once into the kitchen, which opened out onto the street. The host heard the door open and a newcomer enter, and said, without raising his eyes from his ranges, "What will monsieur have?" "Something to eat, and lodging." "Nothing more easy," said mine host, but on turning his head and taking an observation of the traveler, he said, "For pay." The man drew from his pocket a large leather purse, and answered, "I have money." "Then," said mine host, "I am at your service." The man put his purse back into his pocket, took off his knapsack, and put it down hard by the door, and holding his stick in his hand, sat down on a low stool by the fire. D being in the mountains, the evening of Octobers were cold there. However, as the host passed backwards and forwards, he kept a careful eye on the traveler. "Is dinner almost ready?" said the man. "Directly," said mine host. While the newcomer was warming himself with his back turned, the worthy innkeeper, Joachim Labert, took a pencil from his pocket, and then tore off the corner of an old paper which he had pulled from a little table near the window. On the margin he wrote a line or two, folded it, and handed the scrap of paper to a child, who appeared to serve him as lackey and scullion at the same time. The innkeeper whispered a word to the boy, and he ran off in the direction of the mayor's office. The traveler saw nothing of this. He asked a second time, "Is dinner ready?" "Yes, in a few moments," said the host. The boy came back with the paper. The host unfolded it hurriedly, as one who is expecting an answer. He seemed to read with attention, then, throwing his head on one side, thought for a moment. Then he took a step towards the traveler, who seemed drowned in troublous thoughts. "Monsieur," he said, "I cannot receive you." The traveler half rose from his seat. "Why? Are you afraid I shall not pay you? Or do you want me to pay in advance? I have money, I tell you." "It is not that." "Then what then? What then?" "You have money." "Yes," said the man. "And I," said the host, "I have no room." "Well, put me in the stable," quietly replied the man. "I cannot." "Why?" "Because the horses take all the room." "Well," responded the man, "a quarter in the garret, a truss of straw. We will see about that dinner after." "I cannot give you any dinner." This declaration, made in a measured but firm tone, appeared serious to the traveler. He got up. "Ah, bah! I'm dying with hunger. I've walked since sunrise. I've traveled 12 leagues. I will pay. I want something to eat." "I have nothing," said the host. The man burst into a laugh and turned towards the fireplace and the ranges. "Nothing!" he said. "And all that?" "All that is engaged." "By whom?" "By those persons, the wagoners." "How many there are them?" 12. "There is enough there for 20. They have engaged and paid for all of it in advance." The man sat down again and said, without raising his voice, "I am at an inn. I am hungry, and I shall stay." The host bent down his ear and said, in a voice which made him tremble, "Go away!" At these words, the traveler, who was bent over, poking some embers in the fire with the iron-shod end of his stick, turned suddenly around and opened his mouth as if to reply, when the host, looking steadily at him, added in the same low tone, "Stop! No more of that. Shall I tell you your name? Your name is Jean Valjean. Now shall I tell you who you are? When I saw you enter I suspected something. I sent to the mayor's office, and here's the reply. Can you read?" So saying, he held toward him the open paper, which was just come from the mayor. The man cast a look upon it. The innkeeper, after a short silence, said, "It is my custom to be polite to all. Go." The man bowed his head, picked up his knapsack, and went on. The good inn was closed against him. He sought some humble tavern, some poor cellar. Just then a light shone at the end of the street. He saw a pine branch hanging by an iron bracket against the white sky of twilight. He went thither. It was the tavern of the Rue Chauffat. The traveler did not dare to enter by the street door. He slipped into the court, stopped again, then timidly raised the latch and pushed open the door. "Who is it?" said the host. "One who wants supper and a bed." "All right. Here you can sup and sleep." He seated himself near the fireplace and stretched his feet out towards the fire. Half dead from fatigue, an inviting odor came from the pot. All that could be seen of his face under his slouched cap assumed a vague appearance of comfort, which tempered the sorrowful aspect given him by a long-continued suffering. However, one of the men at the table was a fisherman, who had put up his horse at the stable of Laubert's inn before entering the tavern of the Rue de Chauffat. It so happened that he had met that same morning this suspicious-looking traveler, traveling between Bras d'As and I forgot the place. I think it's Escobilon. Now, on meeting him, the man, who seemed already very much fatigued, had asked him to take him on behind, to which the fisherman responded only by doubling his pace. The fisherman, half an hour before, had been one of the throng about Joaquin Labarre, and had himself related his unpleasant meeting with him to the people of the Croix de Coblaz. He beckoned to the tavern-keeper to come to him, which he did. They exchanged a few words in a low voice. The traveler had again relapsed into thought. The tavern-keeper returned to the fire, and laying his hand roughly on his shoulder, said harshly, "You are to clear out from here." The stranger turned round and said mildly, "Ah, Do you know? Yes. They sent me away from the other inn, and we turn you out of this. So where would you have me go? Somewhere else. The man took up his stick and knapsack and went off. As he went out, some children who had followed him from the Quai de Coblaz had seemed to be waiting for him, threw stones at him. He turned angrily and threatened them with his stick, and they scattered like a flock of birds. He passed the prison. An iron chain hung from the door, attached to a bell. He rang. The grating opened. "Monsieur Turnkey," said he, taking off his cap respectfully, "will you open and let me stay here tonight?" The voice answered, "A prison is not a tavern. Get yourself arrested and we will open." The grating closed. He went into a small street where there were many gardens. Some of them were enclosed by hedges, which enlivened the street. Among them he saw a pretty little one-story house where there was light in the window. He looked in, as he had done at the tavern. It was a large whitewashed room, with a bed draped with calico, and a cradle in the corner. Some wooden chairs and a double-barreled gun hung across the wall. A table was set in the center of the room. A brass lamp lighted the coarse white tablecloth. A tin mug full of wine shone like silver, and the brown soup dish was smoking. At this table sat a man, about 40 years old, with a joyous, open countenance, who was trotting a little child upon his knee. Near by him was a young woman, who was suckling another child. The father was laughing, the child was laughing, and the mother was smiling. He rapped faintly on the window. No one heard him. He rapped a second time. He heard the woman say, "Husband, I think I heard someone rap." "No," replied the husband. He rapped a third time. The husband got up, took the lamp, and opened the door. "Monsieur," said the traveler, "I beg your pardon. For pay, can you give me a plate of soup and a corner of the shed in your garden to sleep in? Tell me, can you, for pay?" "Who are you?" demanded the master of the house. The man replied, "I have come from Puy-Moisson. I've walked all day. I've come 12 leagues. Can you, if I pay?" "I wouldn't refuse to lodge any proper person who would pay," said the peasant. "But why do you not go to the inn?" "There is no room." "Bah! That's not possible. There's neither a fair nor a market day. Have you been to Labarre's house?" "Yes." "Well?" The traveler replied hastily, "I don't know. He didn't take me." "Have you been to that place of the Rue Chauffin?" The embarrassment of the stranger increased. He stammered, "They didn't take me either." The peasant's face assumed an expression of distrust. He looked over the newcomer from head to foot, and suddenly exclaimed with a sort of shudder, "Are you the man?" He looked again at the stranger, stepped back, put the lamp on the table, and took down his gun. His wife, on hearing the words, "Are you the man?" started up, and clasping her 2 children, precipitously took refuge behind her husband. She looked at the stranger with affright, her neck bare, her eyes dilated, murmuring in a low tone, "So mourant," which means... Oh, this translation doesn't make sense. Okay. All this happened in less time than it takes to read it. After examining the man for a moment, as one would a viper, the man advanced to the door and said, "Get out." "For pity's sake, a glass of water," said the man. "A gunshot," said the peasant, and then he closed the door violently, and the man heard 2 heavy bolts draw. A moment afterwards the door shutters were shut and noisily barred. Night came on apace. The cold alpine winds were blowing. By the light of the expiring day the stranger perceived, in one of the gardens which fronted the street, a kind of hut, which seemed to be made of turf. He boldly cleared a wooden fence, and found himself in the garden. He neared the hut. Its door was a narrow, low entrance. It resembled, in its construction, the shanties which the road laborers put up for their temporary accommodation. He got down and crawled into the hut. It was warm there, and he found a good bed of straw. He rested a moment upon his bed, motionless from fatigue. Then, as his knapsack on his back troubled him, it would make a good pillow, he began to unbuckle the straps. Just then he heard a ferocious growling, and looking up saw the head of an enormous bulldog at the opening of the hut. It was a dog kennel. He was himself vigorous and formidable. Seizing his stick, he made a shield of his knapsack, got out of the hut as best he could, but not without enlarging the rents in his already tattered garments. When he had, not without difficulty, got over the fence, he again found himself alone in the street, without lodging, roof, or shelter, driven even from the straw bed of the wretched kennel dog. He threw himself rather than seated himself on a stone, and it appears that someone who was passing heard him exclaim, "I am not even a dog!" Then he arose, and he began to tramp again, taking his way out of the town, hoping to find some tree or haystack beneath which he could shelter himself. He walked on for some time, his head bowed down. When he thought he was far away from all human habitation, he raised his eyes, and looked about him inquiringly. He was in a field. Before him was a low hillock covered with stubble, which, after the harvest, looks like a shaved head. The earth was then lighter than the sky, which produced a peculiar sinister effect, and the hill, poor and mean in contour, loomed out, dim and pale, upon the gloomy horizon. The whole prospect was hideous, mean, lugubrious, and insignificant. There was nothing in the field nor upon the hill but one ugly tree, a few steps from the traveller, which seemed to be twisting and contouring itself. He retraced his steps. The gates of D were closed. D, which sustained sieges in the religious wars, was still surrounded, in 1815, by old walls flanked by square towers, since demolished. He passed through a breach and entered the town. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening, and he did not know the streets. He walked at hazard. So he came to the prefecture, then to the seminary. On passing by the cathedral square, he shook his fist at the church. At the corner of this square stands a printing office. There were first printed the proclamations of the emperor and the imperial guard to the army, brought from the island of Elba, and dictated by Napoleon himself. Exhausted with fatigue and hoping for nothing better, he lay down on a stone bench in front of this printing office. Just then an old woman came out of the church. She saw the man lying there in the dark, and said, "What are you doing there, my friend?" He replied harshly, and with anger in his tone, "You see, my good woman, I'm going to sleep." The good woman, who really merited the name, was Madame la Marquise d'R. "Upon the bench?" said she. "For 19 years I've had a wooden mattress," said the man. "Tonight I have a stone one." "You have been a soldier?" "Yes, my good woman, a soldier." "Why don't you go to the inn?" "Because I have no money." "Alas," said Madame de R., "I've only 4 sous in my purse." "Give me them." The man took the 4 sous, and Madame de R. continued, "You cannot find lodging for so little in an inn, but have you tried? You cannot pass the night so. You must be cold and hungry. They should give you lodging for charity." "I have knocked at every door." "Well, what then?" "Everybody has driven me away." The good woman touched the man's arm, and pointed out to him, on the other side of the square, a little low house beside the bishop's palace. "You have knocked at every door?" she asked. "Yes." "Have you knocked at that one there?" "No." "Knock there." Prudence commended to wisdom. That evening, after his walk in the town, the Bishop of D remained quite late in his room. He was busy with his great work on duty, which unfortunately is left incomplete. He carefully dissected all that the fathers and doctors have said on this serious topic. He collated with much labor these injunctions into a harmonious whole, which he wished to offer to souls. At 8 o'clock he was still at work, writing with some inconvenience on little slips of paper, with a large book open on his knees, when Madame Magloire was, as usual, came in to take the silver from the panel near the bed. A moment after, the bishop, knowing that the table was laid, and that his sister was perhaps waiting, closed his book and went into the dining-room. Madame Magloire, I need to brush up on my French, had just finished placing the plates. While he was arranging the table, that's true. While she was arranging the table, she was talking with Mademoiselle Baptistine. The lamp was on the table, which was near the fireplace, where a good fire was burning. Mademoiselle Baptistine was so often related has so often related what occurred at the bishop's house that evening that many persons are still living who can recall the minutest details. Just as the bishop entered, Madame Magloire was speaking with some warmth. She was talking to Mademoiselle upon a familiar subject, and one to which the bishop was quite accustomed. It was a discussion on the means of fastening the front door. It seems that while Madame Magloire was out making provisions for supper, she had heard the news in sundry places. There was talk that an ill-favored runaway, a suspicious vagabond, had arrived and was lurking somewhere in the town, and that some unpleasant adventures were in the town, might befall those who should have come home late that night. Besides that, the policing was very bad, as the prefect and the mayor did not like one another, and were hoping to injure one another by untoward events, that it was the part of wise people to be their own police, and to protect their own persons, and that everyone ought to be careful to shut, bolt, and bar his house properly, and secure his door thoroughly. Madame Magloire dwelt upon those last words, but the bishop, having come from a cold room, seated himself before the fire and began to warm himself. And then he was thinking of something else. He did not hear a word of what was let fall by Madame Magloire, and she repeated it. Then Mademoiselle Baptistine, endeavoring to satisfy Madame Magloire without displeasing her brother, ventured to say timidly, "Brother, do you hear what Madame Magloire says?" "I heard something of it, indistinctly," said the bishop. Then, turning his chair half round, putting his hands on his knees, and raising towards the old servant his cordial and good-humoured face, which the firelight shone upon, he said, "Well, well, what is the matter? Are we all in great danger?" This readiness to question her encouraged Madame Magloire. It seemed to indicate that the bishop was really well nigh alarmed. She continued triumphantly, "Yes, monsieur, it is true! There will something happen tonight in the town. Everyone says so. The police are so badly organized," a convenient repetition, "to live in this mountainous country, and not even have street lamps. If one goes out, it is dark as a pocket. And I say, monsieur, and mademoiselle says also." "Me?" interrupted the sister. "I say nothing. Whatever my brother does is well done." Madame Magloire went on as if she had not heard this protestation. "We say that this house is not safe at all, and if monsieur will permit me, I will go and tell Pauline Mouseboy, the locksmith, to come and put the old bolts into the door again. There they are. It will take but a minute. I say we must have bolts, if only for tonight, for I say that a door which opens by a latch on the outside to the first comer, nothing could be more horrible. And then monsieur has the habit of always saying, 'Come in,' even at midnight. But my goodness, there's no need even to ask leave." At this moment there was a violent knock on the door. "Come in," said the bishop. Can we pause there? The heroism of passive obedience. The door opened. It opened quickly, quite wide, as if pushed by someone boldly and with energy. A man entered. He came in, took one step, and paused, leaving the door open behind him. He had his knapsack on his back, his stick in his hand, and a rough, hard, tired, and fierce look in his eyes, as seen by the firelight. He was hideous. It was an apparition of ill omen. Mademoiselle Magloire had not even the strength to scream. She stood, trembling, with her mouth open. Mademoiselle Baptistine turned, saw the man enter, and started up, half alarmed. Then, slowly turning back again towards the fire, she looked at her brother, and let her face resume its usual calmness and serenity. The bishop looked upon the man with a tranquil eye. As he was opening his mouth to speak, doubtless to ask the stranger what he wanted, the man, leaning with both hands on his club, glanced from one to another, in turn, and without waiting for the bishop to speak, said in a loud voice, "See here. My name is Jean Valjean. I'm a convict. I've been 19 years in the galleys. 4 days ago I was set free, and started for Pontrier, which is my destination. During those 4 days I've walked from Toulon. Today I've walked 12 leagues. When I reached this place this evening, I went to an inn, and they sent me away on account of my yellow passport, which I've shown at the mayor's office, as was necessary. I went to another inn. They said, 'Get out!' It was the same with one as with the other. Nobody would have me. I went to the prison, and the turnkey would not let me in. I crept into a dog kennel, and the dog bit me, and drove me away, as if he had been a man, and you would have said that he knew who I was. I went into the fields to sleep beneath the stars. There were no stars. I thought it would rain, and there was no good God to stop the drops, so I came back to the town to get the shelter of some doorway. There, in the square, I lay down upon a stone. A good woman showed me your house, and said, 'Knock there.' I've knocked. What is this place? Are you an inn? I have money, my savings, 109 francs and 15 sous, which I've earned in the galleys by my work for 19 years. I will pay. What do I care? I have money. I'm very tired. 12 leagues on foot, and I'm so hungry. Can I stay?" "Madame Magloire," said the bishop, "put on another plate." The man took 3 steps, and came near the lamp which stood on the table. "Stop!" he exclaimed, as if he had not been understood. "Not that! Did you understand me? I'm a galley slave, a convict. I'm just from the galleys." He drew from his pocket a large sheet of yellow paper, which he unfolded. "There is my passport, yellow, as you see. That is enough to have me kicked out wherever I go. Will you read it? I know how to read, I do. I learned in the galleys. There's a school there for those who care for it. See, here is what they put in the passport. Jean Valjean, a liberated convict, native of— you don't care for that. It's been 19 years in the galleys, 5 years for burglary, 14 years for having attempted 4 times to escape. This man is very dangerous. There you have it. Everybody has thrust me out. Will you receive me? Is this an inn? Can you give me something to eat and a place to sleep? Have you a stable?" "Madame Magloire," said the bishop, "put some sheets on the bed in the alcove." Madame Magloire went out to fulfill her orders. The bishop turned to the man. "Monsieur, sit down and warm yourself. We're going to take supper presently, and your bed will be made ready while you sup." At last the man quite understood. His face, the expression of which till then had been gloomy and hard, now expressed stupefaction, doubt, and joy, and became absolutely wonderful. He began to stutter like a madman. "True? What? You will keep me? You won't drive me away? A convict? You call me monsieur, and don't say 'Get out, dog,' as everyone else does? I thought that you would send me away, so I told first off who I am. Oh, the fine woman who sent me here! I shall have supper. I shall have a bed like other people, with mattresses and sheets. A bed. It is 19 years that I have not slept on a bed. You are really willing to let me stay? You are good people. Besides, I have money. I will pay well. I beg your pardon, monsieur innkeeper. What is your name? I will pay all you say. You are a fine man. You are an innkeeper, ain't you?" "I am a priest who lives here," said the bishop. "A priest?" said the man. "Oh, noble priest! Then you do not ask any money? You are the curé, aren't you? The curé of this big church? Yes, that's it. How stupid I am. I didn't notice your cap." While speaking, he deposited his knapsack and stick in the corner, replaced his passport in his pocket, and sat down. Mademoiselle Baptistine looked at him pleasantly. He continued, "You are humane, monsieur curé. You don't despise me. A good priest is a good thing. Then you don't want me to pay?" "No," said the bishop. "Keep your money. How much have you? You said 109 francs, I think?" "And 15 sous," said the man. 109 francs and 15 sous. And how long did it take you to earn that? 19 years. 19 years! The bishop sighed deeply. Madame Magloire brought in a plate and set it on the table. "Madame Magloire," said the bishop, "put this plate as near the fire as you can." Then, turning towards his guest, he added, "The night wind is raw in the Alps. You must be cold, monsieur." Every time he said this word, monsieur, with his gently solemn and heartily hospitable voice, the man's countenance lighted up. "Monsieur, to a convict is a glass of water to a dying man of thirst at sea. Ignominy thirsts for respect." "The lamp," said the priest, "gives a very poor light." Madame Magloire understood him, and going to his bedchamber took from the mantel 2 silver candlesticks, lighted the candlesticks, and placed them on the table. Monsieur Curé, said the man, you are good. You don't despise me. You take me into your house. You light your candles for me, and I haven't hid from you where I came from, and how miserable I am. The bishop, who was sitting near him, touched his hand gently and said, You need not tell me who you are. This is not my house. It is the house of Christ. It does not ask any comer whether he has a name, but whether he has affliction. You are suffering. You are hungry, thirsty. Be welcome. And do not thank me. Do not tell me that I take you into my house. This is the home of no man, except him who needs asylum. I tell you who are a traveler, that you are more at home here than I. Whatever is here is yours. What need have I to know your name? Besides, before you told me, I knew it. The man opened his eyes in astonishment. Really? You knew my name? Yes, answered the bishop. Your name is my brother. Stop, stop, Monsieur Curé, exclaimed the man. I was famished when I came in, but you are so kind that now I don't know what I am. That is all gone. The bishop looked at him again and said, You have seen much suffering? Oh, the red blouse, the ball and chain, the plank to sleep on, the heat, the cold, the galley's crew, the lash, the double chain for nothing, the dungeon for a word, even when sick in bed, the chain. The dogs are happier. 19 years, and I'm 46, and now a yellow passport. That is all. Yes, answered the bishop, you have left a place of suffering. But listen, there will be more joy in heaven over the tears of a repentant sinner than over the white robes of 100 good men. If you are leaving that sorrowful place with hate and anger against men, you are worthy of compassion. If you leave it with goodwill, gentleness, and peace, you are better than any of us. Meanwhile, Madame Magloire had served up supper. It consisted of soup made of water, oil, bread, and salt, a little pork, a scrap of mutton, a few figs, a green cheese, and a little loaf of rye bread. She had, without asking, added to the usual dinner of the bishop, a bottle of fine old Maus wine. The bishop's countenance was lighting up with this expression of pleasure, peculiar to hospitable natures. To supper, he said briskly, as was his habit when he had a guest. He seated the man to his right. Mademoiselle Baptistine, perfectly quiet and natural, took her place at the left. The bishop said the blessing, then served the soup himself, according to his usual custom. Then the man fell to, eating greedily. Tranquillity. After having said good night to his sister, Monsieur Bienvenu took one of the silver candlesticks from the table, handed the other to his guest, and said to him, Monsieur, I will show you to your room. The man followed him. The house was so arranged that one could reach the alcove in the oratory only by passing through the bishop's sleeping chambers. Just as they were passing through this room, Madame Magloire was putting the silver in the cupboard at the head of the bed. It was the last thing she did every night before going to bed. The bishop left his guest in the alcove before a clean white bed. The man set down the candlestick upon a small table. Come, said the bishop, a good night's rest to you. Tomorrow morning, before you go, you shall have a cup of warm milk from our cows. Thank you, Monsieur l'Abbé, said the man. Scarcely had he pronounced these words of peace, when suddenly he made a singular motion which would have chilled the two good women in the house with horror, had they witnessed it. Even now it is hard for us to understand what impulse he obeyed at that moment. Did he intend to give a warning, or to throw out menace, or was he simply obeying a sort of instinctive impulse, obscured even to himself? He turned abruptly towards the old man, crossed his arms, and casting a wild look upon his host, exclaimed in a harsh voice, Ah, now indeed, you lodge me in your house, as near you as that? He checked himself, and added, with a laugh in which there was something horrible, Have you reflected upon it? Who tells you that I am not a murderer? The bishop responded, God will take care of that. Then, with gravity, moving his lips, like one praying or talking to himself, He raised the 2 fingers of his right hand and blessed the man, who, however, did not bow, and, without turning his head or looking behind him, went into his chamber. When the alcove was occupied, a heavy siege curtain was drawn in the oratory, concealing the altar. Before this curtain the bishop knelt as he passed and offered a short prayer. As to the man, he was so completely exhausted that he did not even avail himself of the clean white sheets. He blew out the candle with his nostril, after the manner of convicts, fell on the bed, dressed as he was, into a sound sleep. Midnight struck as the bishop came back to his chamber. A few moments afterwards, all in the little house slept. Jean Valjean. Towards the middle of the night, Jean Valjean awoke. Jean Valjean was poor, of a poor peasant family of Brie. In his childhood he had not been taught to read. When he had grown up, he chose the occupation of a pruner at Favre's. His mother's name was Jeanne Mathieu, his father's Jean Valjean, or Valjean, probably a nickname, a contraction of Voilà Jean. Jean Valjean was of a thoughtful disposition, but not sad, which is characteristic of affectionate natures. Upon the whole, however, there was something torpid and insignificant, in the appearance at least, of Jean Valjean. He had lost his parents when very young. His mother died of malpractice in a milk fever. His father, a pruner before him, was killed by a fall from a tree. Jean Valjean now had but one relative left, his sister, a widow with 7 children, girls and boys. His sister had brought up Jean Valjean, and as long as her husband lived, she had taken care of her younger brother. Her husband died, leaving the eldest of these children 8, the youngest 1 year old. Jean Valjean had just reached his 25th year. He took the father's place, and in his turn supported the sister who reared him. This he did naturally, as a duty, even with a sort of moroseness on his part. His youth was spent in rough and ill-recompensed labor. He never was known to have a sweetheart. He did not have time to be in love. He earned in the pruning season 18 sous a day. After that, he hired out as a reaper, workman, teamster, or laborer. He did whatever he could find to do. His sister worked also, but what could she do with 7 little children? It was a sad group, which misery was grasping and closing upon little by little. There was a very severe winter. Jean had no work. The family had no bread, literally no bread, and 7 children. One Sunday night, Maubert Isabeau, the baker on the Place de l'Église at Favre's, had just gone to bed when he heard a violent blow against the barred window of his shop. He got down in time to see an arm thrust through the aperture made of the blow of the fist on the glass. The arm seized a loaf of bread and took it out. Isabeau rushed out. The thief used his legs valiantly. Isabeau pursued him and caught him. The thief had thrown away the bread, but his arm was still bleeding. It was Jean Valjean. All that happened in 1795. Jean Valjean was brought before the tribunals of the time for burglary at night in an inhabited house. He had a gun which he used as well as any marksman in the world, and was something of a poacher, which hurt him, there being a natural prejudice against poachers. Jean Valjean was found guilty. The terms of the code were explicit. Jean Valjean was sentenced to 5 years in the galleys. On the 22nd of April, 1796, it was announced in Paris the victory of Montenotte, achieved by the commanding general of the army of Italy, whom the message of the Directory to the 502nd Floreal, year 4, called Bonaparte. That same day a great chain was riveted at the Jean Valjean was a part of this chain. While they were there, with heavy hammer strokes behind his head, riveting the bolt of his iron collar, he was weeping. The tears choked his words, and he only succeeded in saying from time to time, "I was a pruner at Favre's." Then, sobbing as he was, he raised his right hand and lowered it 7 times, as if he was touching 7 heads of unequal height, and at this gesture one could guess that whatever he had done had been to feed and clothe 7 little children. He was taken to Toulon, at which place he arrived after the journey of 27 days on a cart, the chain still about his neck. At Toulon he was dressed in a red blouse. All his past life was effaced, even his name. He was no longer Jean Valjean. He was numbered 24,601. Near the end of his 4th year, his chance of liberty came to Jean Valjean. His comrades helped him, as they always do in that dreary place, and he escaped. During the evening of the 2nd day he was retaken. He had neither eaten nor slept for 36 hours. The Maritime Tribunal extended his sentence 3 years for this attempt, which made 8. In the 6th year, his turn of escape came again. He tried it, but failed again. He did not answer at roll call, and the alarm cannon was fired. At night, the people of the vicinity discovered him, hidden beneath the keel of a vessel in the stocks. He resisted the galley guard, which seized him. Escape and resistance. This the provisions of the special code punished by an additional 5 years, 2 with the double chain, 13 years. The 10th year, his chance turn came round again. He made another attempt with no better success. 3 years for this new attempt, 16 years. And finally, I think it was in the 13th year, he made yet another, and was retaken after an absence of only 4 hours. 3 years for these 4 hours, 19 years. In October 1815, he was set at large. He had entered in 1796 for having broken a pane of glass and taken a loaf of bread. Jean Valjean entered the galleys, sobbing and shuddering. He went out, hardened. He entered in despair. He went out, sullen. New griefs. When the time for leaving the galleys came, and when there was sounded in the ear of Jean Valjean the strange words, "You are free," the moment seemed improbable and unreal. A ray of living light, a ray of the true light of living men, suddenly penetrated his soul. But this ray quickly faded away. Jean Valjean had been dazzled with the idea of liberty. He had believed in a new life. He soon saw that what sort of liberty that is which has a yellow passport. The day after his liberation, he saw before the door of an orange flower distillery at Grasse some men who were unloading bags. He offered his services. They were in need of help, and accepted them. He set to work. He was intelligent, robust, and handy. He did his best. The foreman appeared to be satisfied. While he was at work, a gendarme passed, noticed him, and asked for his papers. He was compelled to show the yellow passport. That done, Jean Valjean resumed his work. A little while before, he had asked one of the laborers how much they were paid per day for this work, and the reply was 30 sous. At night, when he was obliged to leave the town next morning, he went to the foreman of the distillery and asked for his pay. The foreman did not say a word, but handed him 15 sous. He remonstrated. The man replied, "That's good enough for you." He insisted. The foreman looked him in the eyes and said, "Look out for the lock-up." There again he thought himself robbed. Society, the state, in reducing his savings, had robbed him by wholesale. Now it was the turn of the individual who was robbing him by retail. Liberation is not deliverance. A convict may leave the galleys behind, but not his condemnation. This was what befell him at Grasse. We have seen how he was received at D. The man awakes. As the cathedral clock struck 2, Jean Valjean awoke. What awakened him was too good a bed. For nearly 20 years he had not slept in a bed, and although he had not undressed, the sensation was too novel not to disturb his sleep. Many thoughts came to him, but there was one which continually presented itself, and which drove away all others. What that thought was, we shall tell directly. He had noticed the 6 silver plates and the large ladle that Madame Magloire had put on the table. His mind wavered a whole hour, and a long one, in fluctuation and in struggle. The clock struck 3. He opened his eyes, rose up hastily in bed, reached out his arm, and felt his haversack, which he had put into the corner of the alcove. Then he thrust out his legs, and placed his feet on the ground, and found himself, he knew not how, seated on his bed. He continued in this situation, and would perhaps have remained there until daybreak, if the clock had not struck the quarter or the half-hour. The clock seemed to say to him, "Come along." He rose to his feet, hesitated for a moment longer, and listened. All was still in the house. He walked straight and cautiously towards the window, which he could discern. The night was not very dark. There was a full moon, across which large clouds were driving before the wind. This produced alternations of light and shade, out of doors, eclipses and illuminations, and indoors a kind of glimmer. This glimmer, enough to enable him to find his way, changing with the passing clouds, resembled The night was not very dark. There was a full moon, across which large clouds were driving before the wind. This produced alternations of light and shade, out of doors eclipses and illuminations, and indoors a kind of glimmer. This glimmer, enough to enable him to find his way, changing with the passing clouds, resembled that sort of livid light which falls through the window of a dungeon, before which men are passing and repassing. On reaching the window, Jean Valjean examined it. It had no bars, opened into the garden, and was fastened, according to the fashion of the country, with a little wedge only. He opened it, but as the cold, keen air rushed into the room, he closed it again immediately. He looked into the garden with that absorbed look which studies rather than sees. The garden was enclosed with a white wall, quite low and readily scaled. Beyond, against the sky, he distinguished the tops of trees at equal distances apart, which showed that this wall separated the garden from an avenue or lane planted with trees. When he had taken this observation, he turned, like a man whose mind is made up, went to his alcove, took his haversack, opened it, fumbled in it, took out something which he laid upon the bed, put his shoes into one of his pockets, tied up his bundle, swung it upon his shoulders, put on his cap, and pulled the visor down over his eyes, felt for his stick, and went and put it in the corner of the window, then returned to the bed, and resolutely took up the object which he had laid on it. It looked like a short iron bar, pointed at one end, like a spear. It would have been hard to distinguish in the darkness for what use this piece of iron had been made. Could it be a lever? Could it be a club? In the daytime it would have been seen to be nothing but a miner's drill. At that time the convicts were sometimes employed in quarrying stone on the high hills that surrounded Toulon, and they often had miners' tools in their possession. Miners' drills were of solid iron, terminating at the lower end in a point, by means of which they were sunk into the rock. He took the drill in his right hand, and holding his breath, with stealthy steps he moved towards the door of the next room, which was the bishop's, as we know. On reaching the door he found it unlatched. The bishop had not closed it. What he does. Jean Valjean listened. Not a sound. He pushed the door. He pushed it lightly with the end of his finger, with the stealthy and timorous carefulness of a cat. The door yielded to the pressure with a silent, imperceptible movement, which made the opening a little wider. He waited a moment and then pushed the door again, more boldly. It yielded gradually and silently. The opening was now wide enough for him to pass through, but there was a small table near the door, which with it Jean saw the obstacle. At all hazards the opening must be made still wider. So determined, and pushed the door a third time, harder than before. This time a rusty hinge suddenly sent into the darkness a harsh and prolonged creak. Jean Valjean shivered. The noise of this hinge sounded in his ears as clear and terrible as the trumpet of the judgment day. He stood still, petrified, like the pillar of salt, not daring to stir. Some minutes passed. The door was wide open. He ventured to look into the room. Nothing had moved. He listened. Nothing was stirring in the house. The noise of the rusty hinge had wakened nobody. Suddenly he stopped. He was near the bed. He had reached it sooner than he thought. Nature sometimes joins her effects and her appearances to acts with a sort of serious intelligent appropriateness, as if she would compel us to reflect. For nearly a half-hour a great cloud had darkened the sky. At the moment when Jean Valjean paused before the bed, the cloud broke, as if purposely, and a ray of moonlight crossed the high window, suddenly lighted up the bishop's pale face. He slept tranquilly. He was almost entirely dressed, though in bed, on account of the cold night of the lower Alps, with a dark woolen garment which covered his arms to the wrist. His head had fallen on the pillow in the unstudied attitude of slumber. Over the side of the bed hung his hand, ornamented with the pastoral ring, and which had done so many good deeds, so many pious acts. His entire countenance was lit up with a vague expression of content, hope, and happiness. It was more than a smile, and almost a radiance. Jean Valjean was in the shadow of the iron drill in his hand, erect, motionless, terrified at this radiant figure. He had never seen anything comparable to it. This confidence filled him with fear. The moral world has no greater spectacle than this: a troubled and restless conscience on the verge of committing an evil deed, contemplating the sleep of a good man. He did not remove his eyes from the old man. The only thing which was plain from his attitude and his countenance was a strange indecision. You would have said he was hesitating between two realms, that of the doomed and that of the saved. He appeared ready either to cleave his skull or kiss his hand. In a few moments he raised his left hand slowly to his forehead and took off his hat. Then, letting his hand fall with the same slowness, Jean Valjean resumed his contemplations, his cap in his left hand, his club in his right, and his hair bristling on the fierce-looking head. Under this frightful gaze the bishop still slept in the profoundest peace. The crucifix above the mantelpiece was dimly visible in the moonlight, apparently extending its arms towards both, with a benediction for one and a pardon for the other. Suddenly Jean Valjean put on his cap, then passed quickly, without looking at the bishop, along the bed, straight to the cupboard which he perceived near its head. He raised the drill to force the lock. The key was in it. He opened it. The first thing he saw was the basket of silver. He took it, crossed the room with hasty stride, careless of the noise, reached the door, entered the oratory, took his stick, stepped out, put the silver in his knapsack, threw away the basket, ran across the garden, leaped over the wall like a tiger, and fled. The bishop at work. The next day, at sunrise, Monsieur Bienvue was walking in the garden. Madame Magloire ran towards him, quite beside herself. "Monsieur, monsieur!" cried she, "does your greatness know where the silver basket is?" "Yes," said the bishop. "God be praised," said she. "I did not know what had become of it." The bishop had just found the basket on a flower bed. He gave it to Madame Magloire and said, "There it is." "Yes," said she, "but there's nothing in it. The silver?" "Ah," said the bishop, "it is the silver, then, that troubles you. I do not know where that is." "Good heavens! It is stolen! That man who came last night stole it!" And in the twinkling of an eye, with all the agility of which her age was capable, Madame Magloire ran to the oratory, went into the alcove, and came back to the bishop. The bishop was bending with some sadness over the Cochlearia de Guillons, which the basket had broken in falling. He looked up at Madame Magloire's cry. "Monsieur, the man is gone! The silver is stolen!" While she was uttering this exclamation, her eyes fell on an angle of the garden where she saw traces of an escalade. A capstone of the wall had been thrown down. "See, there is where he got out! He jumped into the Cochefilet lane! The abominable fellow! He has stolen our silver!" The bishop was silent for a moment. Then, raising his serious eye, he said mildly to Madame Magloire, "Now, first, does this silver belong to us?" Madame Magloire did not answer. After a moment the bishop continued, "Madame Magloire, I have for a long time wrongfully withheld this silver. It belonged to the poor. Who was this man? A poor man, evidently." In a few minutes he was breakfasting at the same table at which Jean Valjean sat the night before. While breakfasting, Monsieur Bienvue pleasantly remarked to his sister, who said nothing, and Madame Magloire, who was grumbling to herself, that there was really no need even of a wooden spoon or fork to dip a piece of bread into a cup of milk. Just as the brother and sister were rising from the table, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened. A strange, fierce group appeared on the threshold. 3 men were holding a fourth by the collar. The 3 men were gendarmes. The fourth, Jean Valjean. The brigadier of gendarmes, who appeared to head the group, was near the door. He advanced towards the bishop, giving a military salute. "Monsieur," said he. At this word, Jean Valjean, who was sullen, and seemed entirely cast down, raised his head with a stupefied air. "Monsieur," he murmured, "then it is not the curé?" "Silence," said a gendarme. "It is Monsieur the bishop." In the meantime, Monsieur Bienvue had approached as quickly as his great age permitted. "Ah, there you are," said he, looking towards Jean Valjean. "I'm glad to see you. But I gave you the candlesticks also, which were silver like the rest, and would bring 200 francs. Why did you not take them along with your plates?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes and looked at the bishop with an expression which no human tongue could describe. "Monsieur," said the brigadier, "then what this man said was true? We met him. He was going like a man who was running away, and we arrested him in order to see. He had this silver." "And he told you," interrupted the bishop with a smile, that it had been given to him by a good old priest, with whom he had passed the night. I see it all. And you brought him back here? It is all a mistake." "If that is so," said the brigadier, "we can let him go." "Certainly," replied the bishop. The gendarmes released Valjean, who shrank back. "Is it true that they let me go?" he said in a voice almost inarticulate, as if he were speaking in his sleep. "Yes, you can go. Do you not understand?" said the gendarme. "My friend," said the bishop, "before you go away, here are your candlesticks. Take them." He went to the mantelpiece, took the 2 candlesticks, and brought them to Jean Valjean. The two women beheld the action without a word or gesture or look that might disturb the bishop. Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the two candlesticks mechanically and with a wild appearance. "Now," said the bishop, "go in peace. By the way, my friend, when you come again, you need not come through the garden. You can always come in and go out by the front door. It is closed only with a latch, day or night." Then, turning to the gendarmes, he said, "Messieurs, you can retire." The gendarmes withdrew. Jean Valjean felt like a man who was just about to faint. The bishop approached him and said in a low voice, "Forget not, never forget, that you have promised me to use this silver to become an honest man." Jean Valjean, who had no recollection of this promise, stood confounded. The bishop had laid much stress upon these words as he uttered them. He continued solemnly, "Jean Valjean, my brother, you belong no longer to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I am buying for you. I withdraw it from dark thoughts and from the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God." Jean Valjean went out of the city as if he were escaping. He made all haste to get into the open country, taking the first lanes and by-paths that offered, without noticing that he was every moment retracing his steps. He wandered thus all morning. He had eaten nothing, but felt no hunger. He was the prey of a multitude of new sensations. As the sun was sinking towards the horizon, lengthening the shadows on the ground of the smallest pebble, Jean Valjean was seated behind a thicket, in a large reddish plain, an absolute desert. There was no horizon but the Alps, not even the steeple of a village church. Jean Valjean might have been 3 leagues from D. A by-path which crossed the plain passed a few steps from the thicket. In the midst of this meditation, which would have heightened not a little the frightful effect of his rags to anyone who might have met him, he heard a joyous sound. He turned his head, and saw, coming along the path, a little Savoyard, a dozen years old, singing, with his hurdy-gurdy at his side, and his marmot-box on his back. One of those pleasant and gay youngsters who go from place to place, with their knees sticking through their trousers. Always singing, the boy stopped from time to time, and played at tossing some pieces of money that he had in his hand, probably his whole fortune. Among them there was one 40-sou piece. The boy stopped by the side of the thicket without seeing Jean Valjean, and tossed up his handful of sous, until the time he had skilfully caught the whole of them upon the back of his hand. This time the 40-sou piece escaped him, and rolled towards the thicket, near Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean put his foot upon it. The boy, however, had followed this piece with his eye, and had seen where it went. He was not frightened, and walked straight to the man. It was an entirely solitary place. Far as the eye could reach, there was no one on that plain or in the path. Nothing could be heard but the faint cries of a flock of birds of passage. They were flying across the sky at an immense height. The child turned his back to the sun, which made his hair look like threads of gold, and flushed the savage face of Jean Valjean with a lurid glow. "Monsieur," said the little Savoyard, with that childish confidence which is made of ignorance and innocence, "my piece." "What is your name?" said Jean Valjean. "Petit Gervais, monsieur." "Get out," said Jean Valjean. "Monsieur," continued the boy, "give me my piece." Jean Valjean dropped his head and did not answer. The child began again. "My piece, monsieur." Jean Valjean's eye remained fixed on the piece. "My piece!" exclaimed the boy. "My white piece! My silver!" Jean Valjean did not appear to understand. The boy took him by the collar of his blouse and shook him, and at the same time he made an effort to move the big iron-soled shoe which was placed upon his treasure. "I want my piece! My 40-sou piece!" The child began to cry. Jean Valjean raised his head. He still kept his seat. His look was troubled. He looked upon the boy with an air of wonder, then reached out his hand towards his stick, and exclaimed in a terrible voice, "Who's there?" "Me, monsieur," answered the boy. "Petit Gervais. Me, me. Give me my 40 sous, if you please. Take away your foot, monsieur, if you please." Then, becoming angry, small as he was, and almost threatening, "Come now, will you take away your foot? Why don't you take away your foot?" "Ah, you hear yet," said Jean Valjean, and rising hastily to his feet, without releasing the piece of money, he added, "You'd better take care of yourself." The boy looked at him in terror, then began to tremble from head to foot, and after a few seconds of stupor, took to flight, and ran with all his might, without daring to turn his head or utter a cry. At a little distance, however, he stopped for want of breath, and Jean Valjean, in his reverie, heard him sobbing. In a few minutes the boy was gone. The sun had gone down. In a few minutes the boy was gone. The sun had gone down. The shadows were deepening around Jean Valjean. He had not eaten during the day. Probably he had had some fever. He had remained standing, and had not changed his attitude since the child fled. His breathing was at long and unequal intervals. His eyes were fixed on a spot 10 or 12 steps before him, and seemed to be studying with profound attention the form of an old piece of blue crockery that was lying in the grass. All at once he shivered. He began to feel the cold night air. He pulled his cap down over his forehead, sought mechanically to fold the button his blouse around him, stepped forward, and stooped to pick up his stick. At that instant he perceived a 40-sou piece, which his foot had half buried in the ground, and which glistened among the pebbles. It was like an electric shock. "What is that?" said he, between his teeth. He drew back a step or two, then stopped, without the power to withdraw his gaze from that point which his foot had covered the instant before, as if the thing that glistened there in the obscurity had been an open eye fixed upon him. After a few minutes he sprang convulsively towards the piece of money, seized it, and rising looked away over the plains, straining his eyes towards all points of the horizon, standing and trembling like a frightened deer which is seeking a place of refuge. He saw nothing. Night was falling. The plain was cold and bare. Thick purple mists were rising in the glimmering twilight. He said, "Oh!" and began to walk rapidly in the direction in which the child had gone. After some 30 steps he stopped, looked around, and saw nothing. Then he called out with all his might, "Petit Gervais! Petit Gervais!" and then he listened. There was no answer. He met a priest on horseback. He went up to him and said, "Monsieur Curé, have you seen a child go by?" "No," said the priest. "Petit Gervais was his name." "I've seen nothing." He took 2 5-franc pieces from his bag and gave them to the priest. "Monsieur Curé, this is for your poor. Monsieur Curé, he is a little fellow about 10 years old, with a marmot, a thing and a hurdy-gurdy. He went this way, one of these Savoyards. You know?" "I have not seen him." "Petit Gervais, is this village near here? Can you tell me?" "If it be as you say, my friend, the little fellow is a foreigner. They roam about this country. Nobody knows them." Jean Valjean hastily took out 2 more 5-franc pieces and gave them to the priest. "For your poor," he said, then added wildly, "Monsieur Abbé, have me arrested. I'm a robber." The priest put spurs on his horse and fled in great fear. Jean Valjean began to run again in the direction which he had first taken. He went on in this wise for a considerable distance, looking around, calling and shouting, but met nobody else. 2 or 3 times he left the path and looked at what seemed to be somebody lying down or crouching. It was only low bushes or rocks. Finally, at a place where 3 paths met, he stopped. The moon was rising. He strained his eyes in the distance and called out once more, Petit Gervais! Petit Gervais! Petit Gervais!" His cries died away in the mist, without even awakening an echo. Again he murmured, "Petit Gervais!" but with a feeble and almost inarticulate voice. That was his last effort. His knees suddenly bent under him, as if an invisible power overwhelmed him at a blow with the weight of his bad conscience. He fell exhausted upon a great stone, his hands clenched in his hair, his face on his knees, and exclaimed, "What a wretch I am!" Then his heart swelled, and he burst into tears. It was the first time he had wept for 19 years. While he wept, the light grew brighter and brighter in his mind. An extraordinary light, a light at once transporting and terrible. His past life, his first offense, his long expiation, his brutal exterior, his hardened interior, his release made glad by so many schemes of vengeance, what had happened to him at the bishop's, his last action, this theft of 40 sous from a child, a crime meaner and more monstrous than it came after the bishop's pardon. All this returned and appeared to him clearly, but in a light that he had never seen before. He beheld his life, and it seemed to him horrible, his soul, and it seemed to him frightful. There was, however, a softened light upon that life and upon that soul. It seemed to him that he was looking upon Satan by the light of paradise. How long did he weep thus? What did he do after weeping? Where did he go? Nobody ever knew. It is known simply that on that very night the stage driver who drove at that time on the Grenoble route had arrived at D about 3 o'clock in the morning, saw as he passed through the Bishop's Street a man in the attitude of prayer, kneeling upon the pavement in the shadow before the door of Monsieur Bienvue. To entrust is sometimes to abandon. One mother meets another. There was, during the first quarter of the present century, at Montfermeil, near Paris, a sort of chop-house. It is not there now. It was kept by a man and his wife, named Thénardier, and was situated in the lane Boulanger. Above the door, nailed flat against the wall, was a board, upon which something was painted that looked like a man carrying on his back another man, wearing the heavy epaulettes of a general, gilt with large silver stars. Red blotches typified blood. The remainder of the picture was smoke, and probably represented a battle. Beneath was an inscription, "To the Sergeant of Waterloo." Nothing is commoner than a cart or wagon before the door of an inn. Nevertheless, the vehicle, or more properly speaking, the fragment of a vehicle, which obstructed the street in front of the Sergeant of Waterloo, one evening in the spring of 1815, certainly would have attracted, by its bulk, the attention of any painter who might have been passing. It was the forecarriage of one of those drays for carrying heavy articles, used in wooden countries for transporting joists and trunks of trees. It consisted of a massive iron axle-tree with a pivot to which a heavy pole was attached, and which was supported by 2 enormous wheels. As a whole it was squat, crushing, and misshapen. It might have been fancied a gigantic gun-carriage. Under the axle-tree hung festooned a huge chain, fit for a Goliath of the galleys. The middle of the chain was hanging quite near the ground, under the axle, and upon the bend, as on a swinging rope, 2 little girls were seated that evening, in exquisite grouping, the smaller, 18 months old, in the lap of the larger, who was 2 years and a half old. The mother, a woman whose appearance was rather forbidding, but touching at this moment, was seated on the sill of the inn, swinging the 2 children by a long string, while she brooded them with eyes, for fear of accident, with that animal but heavenly expression peculiar to maternity. At each vibration the hideous lynx uttered a creaking noise like an angry cry. The little ones were in ecstasies. The setting sun mingled in the joy, and nothing could be more charming than this caprice of chance, which made of a Titan's chain a swing for cherubim. A woman was before her at a little distance, but also with a child, which she bore in her arms. She was carrying, in addition, a large carpet-bag, which seemed heavy. This woman's child was one of the divinest things that can be imagined, a little girl of 2 or 3 years. She might have entered the lists with the other little ones for coquetry of attire. She wore a headdress of fine linen, ribbons at her shoulders, and Valenciennes lace on her cap. The folds of her skirt were raised enough to show her plump, fine white leg. She was charmingly rosy and healthful. The pretty little creature gave one a desire to bite her cherry cheeks. We can say nothing of her eyes, except that they must have been very large, and were fringed with superb lashes. She was asleep. As to the mother, she seemed poor and sad. She had the appearance of a working woman who was seeking to return to the life of a peasant. It was Fantine. The 2 women walked together. "My name is Madame Thénardier," said the mother of the 2 girls. We keep this in." This Madame Thénardier was a red-haired, brawny, angular woman of the soldier's wife type in all its horror, and singularly enough, she had a lolling air which she had gained from novel reading. She was a masculine lackadaisicalness. Old romances impressed on the imaginations of mistresses of chop-houses have such effects. She was still young, scarcely 30 years old. If this woman, who was seated, stooping, had been upright, perhaps her towering form and her broad shoulders, those of a movable colossus, fit for a market woman, would have dismayed the traveler, disturbed her confidence, and prevented what we have to relate. A person seated instead of standing, fate hangs on such a thread as that. The traveler told her story, a little modified. She said she was a working woman and her husband was dead. Not being able to procure work in Paris, she was going to search of it elsewhere, in her own province, that she had left Paris that morning on foot, that carrying her child she had become tired, and meeting the Villaume stage had got in, that from Villaume she had come on foot to Montfermeil, that the child had walked a little, but not much, she was so young, that she was compelled to carry her, and the jewel had fallen asleep. At these words she gave her daughter a passionate kiss, which wakened her. The child opened its large blue eyes, like its mother's, and saw, what? Nothing, everything, with that serious and sometimes severe air of little children, which is one of the mysteries of their shining innocence before our shadowy virtues. One would say that they felt themselves to be angels, and knew us to be human. Then the child began to laugh, and although the mother restrained her, slipped to the ground with the indomitable energy of a little one that wants to run about. All at once she perceived the two others in their swing, stopped short, put out her tongue in token of admiration. Mother Thénardier untied the children and took them from the swing, saying, "Play together, all three of you." At that age acquaintance is easy, and in a moment the little Thénardiers were playing with the newcomer, making holes in the ground with their intense delight. This newcomer was very sprightly. The goodness of her mother was written in the gaiety of the child. She had taken a splinter of wood, which she used as a spade, and was stoutly digging a hole fit for a fly. The gravedigger's work is charming when done by a child. The two women continued to chat. "What do you call your brat?" "Cosette." "How old is she?" "She's going to be 3 years." "The age of my oldest." The three girls were grouped in an attitude of deep anxiety and bliss. A great event had occurred. A large worm had come out of the ground. They were afraid of it, and yet in ecstasies over it. Their bright foreheads touched each other, 3 heads in one halo of glory. "Children!" exclaimed the Thénardier mother. "How soon they know one another! See them! One would swear they were 3 sisters." These words were the spark which the other mother was probably awaiting. She seized the hand of Madame Thénardier and said, "Will you keep my child for me?" Madame Thénardier made a motion of surprise, which was neither consent nor refusal. Cosette's mother continued, "You see, I cannot take my child into the country. Work forbids it. With a child I could not find a place there. They are so absurd in that district. It is God who has led me before your inn. The sight of your little ones, so pretty and clean and happy, has overwhelmed me. I said, 'There is a good mother. They will be like 3 sisters, and then it will not be long before I come back. Will you keep her for me?' 'I must think over it,' said Thénardier. 'I will give 6 francs a month.' Here a man's voice was heard from within. 'Not less than 7 francs, and 6 months paid in advance.' 6 times 7 are 42, said Madame Thénardier. 'I will give it,' said the mother. 'And 15 francs extra for first expenses,' added the man. 'That's 57 francs, added Madame Thénardier. 'I will give it,' said the mother. 'I have 80 francs. That will leave me enough to go into the country if I walk. I will earn some money there, and as soon as I have it I will come for my little one.' The man's voice returned. 'Has the child a wardrobe?' 'That is my husband,' said Madame Thénardier. 'Certainly she has, the poor darling. I knew it was your husband. And a fine wardrobe it is, too, an extravagant wardrobe, everything in dozens, and silk dresses like a lady. They are here in my carpet-bag.' "You must leave that here," said the man's voice. "Of course I shall give it to you," said the mother. "It would be strange if I should leave my child naked." The face of the master appeared. "It is all right," said he. The bargain was concluded. The mother passed the night at the inn, gave her money, and left her child, fastened again her carpet-bag, diminished by her child's wardrobe and very light now, and set off the next morning, expecting soon to return. These partings are arranged tranquilly, but they are full of despair. A neighbor of the Thénardiers met this mother on the way, and came in, saying, "I've just met a woman in the street who was crying as if her heart would break." When Cosette's mother had gone, the man said to his wife, "That will do me for my note of 110 francs, which falls due tomorrow. I was 50 francs short. Do you know I should have had a sheriff and a protest? You have proved a good mousetrap with your little ones." "Without knowing it," said the woman. First sketch of two equivocal faces. The captured mouse was a very puny one, but the cat exulted even over a lean mouse. What were the Thénardiers? We will say but a word just here. By and by the sketch will be completed. They belonged to that bastard class formed of low people who have risen, and intelligent people who have fallen, which lies between the classes called middle and lower, and which unites some of the faults of the latter with nearly all the vices of the former, without possessing the generous impulses of the workman, or the respectability of the bourgeoisie. This Thénardier, if we may believe him, had been a soldier, a sergeant, he said. He probably had made the campaign of 1815, and had even borne himself bravely, according to all that appeared. We shall see hereafter in what his bravery consisted. The sign of his inn was an allusion to one of his feats of arms. He had painted it himself, for he knew how to do a little of everything, badly. The Lark. To be wicked does not ensure prosperity, for the inn did not succeed well. Thanks to Fantine's 57 francs, Thénardier had been able to avoid a protest and to honor his signature. The next month they were still in need of money, and the woman carried Cosette's wardrobe to Paris and pawned it for 60 francs. When this sum was spent, the Thénardiers began to look upon the little girl as a child which they sheltered for charity, and treated her as such. Her clothes being gone, they dressed her in the cast-off garments of the little Thénardiers, that is, in rags. They fed her on odds and ends, a little better than the dog, and a little worse than the cat. The dog and cat were her messmates. Cosette ate with them under the table in a wooden dish. Her mother, as we shall see hereafter, who had found a place at Sur M, wrote, or rather had some one write for her every month, inquiring news of her child. The Thénardiers replied invariably, "Cosette is doing very well." The 6 months passed away. The mother sent 7 francs for the 7th month, and continued to send this sum regularly month after month. The year was not ended before Thénardier said, "Pretty price, that is. What does she expect us to do for her for 7 francs? And he wrote, demanding 12 francs. The mother, whom he persuaded that her child was happy and doing well, assented, and forwarded 12 francs. The woman was unkind to Cosette. Éponine and Azelma were unkind also. Children at that age are only copies of the mother. The size is reduced, that is all. A year passed, and then another. People used to say, "What good people these Thénardiers are! They are not rich, and yet they bring up a poor child." They thought Cosette was forgotten by her mother. Meantime, Thénardier, having learned in some obscure way that the child was probably illegitimate, and that its mother could not acknowledge it, demanded 15 francs a month, saying that the creature was growing and eating, and threatening to send her away. "She won't humbug me," he exclaimed. "I will confound her with the brat in the midst of her concealment. I must have more money." The mother paid 15 francs. From year to year the child grew, and her misery also. So long as Cosette was very small, she was the scapegoat of the 2 other children. As soon as she began to grow a little, that is to say, before she was 5 years old, she became the servant of the house. It was a harrowing sight to see, in the winter time, the poor child, not yet 6 years old, shivering under the tatters of what was once a calico dress, sweeping the street, before daylight, with an enormous broom in her little red hands, and tears in her large eyes. In the place she was called the Lark. People like figurative names, and are pleased thus to name this little being, not larger than a bird, trembling, frightened, and shivering, awake every morning, first of all in the house and the village. Only the poor lark never sang. The Descent. History of an Improvement in Jet Work. What had become of this mother, in the meantime, who, according to the people of Montfermeil, seemed to have abandoned her child? Where was she? What was she doing? After leaving her little cassette with the Thénardiers, she went on her way, and arrived at M-sur-M. That is, it will be remembered, was in 1818. Fantine had left the province some 12 years before, and M-sur-M had greatly changed in appearance. While Fantine had been slowly sinking deeper and deeper into misery, her native village had been prosperous. Within about 2 years there had been accomplished there one of the most industrial changes, which are the great events of small communities. From time immemorial, the special occupation of the inhabitants of M-sur-M had been the imitation of English jets and German black glass trinkets. The business had always been dull in consequence of the high price of the raw material, which reacted upon the manufacture. At the time of Fantine's return to M-sur-M, an entire transformation had been effected in the production of these black goods. Towards the end of the year 1815, an unknown man had established himself in the city, and had conceived the idea of substituting gumlac for resin in the manufacture, and for bracelets in particular. He made the clasps by simply bending the ends of the metal together instead of soldering them. This very slight change had worked a revolution. This very slight change had in fact reduced the price of the raw material enormously, and this had rendered it possible, first, to raise the wages of the laborer, a benefit to the country; secondly, to improve the quality of the goods, an advantage to the customer; and thirdly, to sell them at lower price, even while making 3 times the profit, a gain for the manufacturer. Thus we have 3 results from one idea. In less than 3 years the inventor of this process had become rich, which was well, and had made all round him rich, which was better. He was a stranger in the department. Nothing was known of his birth, and but little of his early history. The story went that he came to the city with very little money, a few hundred francs at most. From this slender capital, under the inspiration of an ingenious idea, made fruitful by order and care, he had drawn a fortune for himself, and a fortune for the whole region. On his arrival at M-sur-M, he had the dress, the manners, and the language of a laborer only. It seemed that the very day on which he thus obscurely entered the little city of M-sur-M, just at dusk, on a December evening, with his bundle on his back, and a thorn-stick in his hand, a great fire had broken out in the town-house. The man rushed into the fire, and saved, at the peril of his life, 2 children, who proved to be those of the captain of the gendarmes, and in the hurry and gratitude of the moment no one thought to ask him for his passport. He was known from that time by the name of Father Madeleine. He was a man of about 50, who always appeared to be preoccupied in his mind, and who was good-natured. This was all that could be said about him. Father Madeleine employed everybody. He had only one condition: be an honest man, be an honest woman. As we have said, in the midst of this activity, of which he was the cause and the pivot, Father Madeleine had made his fortune, but, very strangely for a mere man of business, that did not appear to be his principal care. It seemed that he thought much for others, and little for himself. In 1820 it was known that he had 630,000 francs standing to his credit in the banking house at Lafitte, but before setting aside his 630,000 francs for himself, he had expended more than 1 million for the city and for the poor. At first, when he began to attract the public attention, the good people said, "This is a fellow who wishes to get rich." When they saw him enrich the country before he enriched himself, the same good people said, "This man is ambitious." This seemed the more probable, since he was religious and observed the forms of the Church to a certain extent, a thing which much approved of in those days. He went regularly to hear Mass every Sunday. At length, in 1819, it was reported in the city one morning that upon the recommendation of the prefect, and in consideration of the services he had rendered to the country, Father Madeleine had been appointed by the king mayor of M. Those who had pronounced the newcomer an ambitious man eagerly seized this opportunity, which all men desire, to exclaim, "There, what did I tell you?" M. was filled with the rumor, and reports proved to be well founded, for a few days afterwards the nomination appeared in the Moniteur. The next day Father Madeleine declined. In the same year, 1819, the results of the new process invented by Madeleine had a place in the Industrial Exhibition, and upon the report of the jury the king named the inventor a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. There was a new rumor for the little city. Well, it was the cross of the Legion of Honor that he wanted. Father Madeleine declined the cross. Decidedly this man was an enigma, and good people gave up the field, saying, "After all, he is a sort of adventurer." As we have seen, the country owed a great deal to this man, and the poor owed him everything. He was so useful that all were compelled to honor him, and so kind that no one could help loving him. His workmen in particular adored him, and he received their adoration with a sort of melancholy gravity. After he became rich, those who constituted society bowed to him as they met, and in the city he began to be called Monsieur Madeleine. But his workmen and the children continued to call him Father Madeleine, and at that name his face always wore a smile. As his wealth increased, invitations rained in on him. Society claimed him. The little exclusive parlors of M, which were carefully guarded, and in earlier days, of course, had been closed to the artisan, opened wide their doors to the millionaire. 1,000 advances were made to him, but he refused them all. And again the gossips were at no loss. He is an ignorant man, and of poor education. No one knows where he came from. He does not know how to conduct himself in good society, and it is by no means certain that he knows how to read. When they saw him making money, they said, "He is a merchant." When they saw the way in which he scattered his money, they said, "He is ambitious." When they saw him refuse to accept honors, they said, "He is an adventurer." When they saw him repel the advances of the fashionable, they said, "He is a brute." In 1820, 5 years after his arrival at M, the services that he rendered to the region were so brilliant, and the wish of the whole population so unanimous, that the king again appointed him mayor of the city. He refused again, but the prefect resisted his determination. The principal citizens came and urged him to accept, and the people in the streets begged him to do so. All insisted so strongly that at last he yielded. It was remarkable that what appeared most of all to bring him to this determination was the almost angry exclamation of an old woman belonging to the poorer class, who cried out to him from her doorstone with some temper, "A good mayor is a good thing. Are you afraid of the good you can do?" This was the third step in his ascent. Father Madeleine had become Monsieur Madeleine, and Monsieur Madeleine had now become Monsieur the Mayor. Moneys deposited with Lafitte. Nevertheless, he remained as simple as at first. He had gray hair, a serious eye, the brown complexion of a laborer, and the thoughtful countenance of a philosopher. He usually wore a hat with a wide brim, and a long coat of coarse cloth buttoned to the chin. He fulfilled his duties as the mayor, but beyond that his life was isolated. He talked with very few persons. He shrank from compliments, and with a touch of the hat walked on rapidly. He smiled to avoid talking, and gave to avoid smiling. The women said of him, "What a good bear!" His pleasure was to walk in the fields. He always took his meals alone, with a book open before him, in which he read. His library was small, but well selected. He loved books. Books are cold but sure friends. As his growing fortune gave him more leisure, it seemed that he profited by it to cultivate his mind. Since he had been at M, it was remarked from year to year that his language became more polished, choicer, and more gentle. Although he was no longer young, it was reported that he was of prodigious strength. He would offer a helping hand to anyone who needed it, help up a fallen horse, push at a stalled wheel, or seize by the horns a bull that had broken loose. He always had his pockets full of money which he passed out, and empty when he returned. When he passed through a village, the ragged little youngsters would run after him with joy, and surround him like a swarm of flies. He did a multitude of good deeds, as secretly as bad ones are usually done. He would steal into houses in the evening, and furtively mount the stairs. A poor devil, in returning to his garret, would find that his door had been opened, sometimes even forced, during his absence. The poor man would cry out, "Some thief has been here!" When he got in, the first thing that he would see would be a piece of gold lying on the table. The thief, who had been there, was Father Madeleine. He was affable and sad. The people used to say, "There is a rich man who does not show pride. There is a fortunate man who does not appear contented." Some pretended that he was a mysterious personage, and declared that no one ever went into his room, which was a true anchorite cell, furnished with hour-glasses, and enlivened with death's heads and crossbones. So much was said of this kind, that some of the more mischievous of the elegant young ladies of M called on him one day, and said, "Monsieur Maire, will you show us your room? We have heard that it is a grotto." He smiled, and introduced them on the spot to his grotto. They were well punished for their curiosity. It was a room very well fitted